Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Misconceptions. I am excited to welcome today a colleague that I have actually only heard of. I don't know that I've met you formally in person. I know I tried to get into your lecture at the conference and it was kind of like sold out and there was not even walking or sitting room. Welcome, Nicole McNellis. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, that was the PSI conference this summer was quite an experience.
Yes, we literally had people sitting on the floor. It was ridiculous. I think it gave us an insight into how important this topic is because you spoke about mom rage or maternal rage. And I'd love, before we get into the topic, I'd like to know more about who you are professionally. Tell us about what brought you into this world of maternal health.
Yeah, so my name is Nicole McNellis. I am a perinatal mental health therapist in the Philadelphia area with my own private practice. And yeah, what brought me into this field, I think, is what brings so many of us into this field is I was a therapist doing my thing in my career, and then I had my kids, and I was like, wow, this is a life-changing experience. It's a life-changing experience. It's such a huge transformation. So my children are very, very much a part of where I am now in my career. And honestly, my experiences with them, especially with my first as a very young mom, really had me looking for my own support in the field. And then I decided, wait a second, I want to provide that support. I want to be the therapist on the other side of that email or the other side of that phone call for a mom who's looking for support during these really vulnerable and tender times. And so that was how I ended up in the field. So I like to say that I am a therapist mom and a mom therapist. I think that really encapsulates um, what I do. And then because of just kind of who I am and my personality, I have a tendency to be slightly intense. I was doing my private practice for a few years, specializing in maternal mental health and thinking about how do I move beyond the therapy room? Kind of what this work is so important to me. I felt like I wanted to talk about it to more people and wanted to, engage in an additional way, in addition to the work I do in the therapy room that I love. And so on a whim, honestly, I sent in my proposal to to PSI for the conference and they accepted it. And now I've been talking about maternal rage ever since. So that's kind of how I ended up at this point. So I think my story really reflects the story of a lot of us in the
For
field. And I
sure.
think it's wonderful. I think when we bring lived experience to this work, I think that's so, so powerful. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. How old is your oldest now? The one that got you onto this career path.
just turned 12.
Okay.
We
Okay.
are on we are on the precipice
Oh
of the
boy.
next big phase of parenting.
Good luck. That's all I have to say is good luck. Okay, so when we study or learn about maternal mental health, when we talk about perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, nowhere in the literature does it talk about rage. It maybe we're starting to hear more about irritability, but honestly, that's not even part of like the typical criteria that we're seeing in terms of depression or anxiety or any of the things we typically see. And yet, if you follow Instagram and you read on Facebook and you read the articles that are coming out in like the mass press, there's a lot of discussion and growing conversations around maternal rage or significant anger. I'm wondering how you define rage, and I want to pick that apart with you a little bit.
Yeah, so what you're saying is exactly what I was seeing in the academic literature and then kind of in popular culture. So we don't see maternal rage particularly well defined, and not surprisingly, because it's a women's mental health issue, we don't see it particularly well researched in the academic literature. There's really huge gaps there between what we're seeing kind of in academia and the peer-reviewed journal world and what we're seeing in popular culture. And so really for me as a clinician, I really started to see more of the talk in terms of maternal rage in popular culture. I had clients bringing it to me in the therapy room It especially, it felt like it kind of came to a head during the pandemic where we were seeing it really exploding in the therapy room, but then also in like on social media, and even in kind of larger, news outlets. And so that really got me interested in looking at, I am by training a cognitive behavioral therapist, so I'm always looking for the solutions. Like, give me some really good coping strategies, give me some interventions that I can give to my clients. And you don't find that in the popular culture, right? Or at least not ones that are evidence-based. And so I really started to turn to desperately looking at the academic literature for some guidance around maternal rage. And thankfully, in recent years, there's at least a handful of good studies that have been done on maternal rage. And there's also some really good books that are one in particular that I'm thinking of that's part memoir and part research. And so that has been really nice. So really, because we don't have, so maternal rage isn't a diagnosis. So you're not going to find it in the DSM. What we're starting to see in the academic literature is essentially it's rage experienced during motherhood. And, there are specific symptoms like, irritability, explosiveness, things like that. But that's really it. It's actually not a particularly well fleshed out definition. So that's
How do you define it? Put aside the literature for a minute. How do you define it? What are you hearing? Give me an experience of what you hear from your clients.
what I see with my clients is really, it's a cycle that I see. So what I see is first there's a buildup, right? And that buildup could be, it's that tight feeling in your chest, right? It's that feeling you get when it feels like no one in your household is listening to you and you're saying the same thing over and over again, right? So usually starts with the buildup, right? Then there's an explosion. So the explosion could be yelling, right? Here's a really interesting thing. The explosion could be outward or it could be inward, right? We start to say, I can't believe I'm feeling this angry, like I'm such a bad mom, right? So there's some sort of explosion. And then you feel badly, and that's kind of the aftermath. So that's what I see with my clients. I see a buildup, I see an explosion, and then I see the aftermath, right? So I really kind of see it in those parts, and I see that pretty consistently. So, and the expression of anger again could be any number of things, like, yelling is what we see pretty frequently, but then the negative self-talk is pretty common also. So,
Do you feel like the negative self-talk is kind of a little bit of a unique feature of the women's mothers experience of this process, or is that something that could, I'm just thinking about like, how are we differentiating this as just general, I'm so angry, right? Or I just lost it, right? I think how many times we have said that over the years of my own parenting, I lost it with her in with this situation or with him, right? And are we differentiating at all in terms of this negative self-talk or like I'm a bad mom, I'm a failure? Is there some component of that that's unique?
yeah, so the way that maternal rage is unique is that the rage is specifically connected to something that's happening in motherhood, right? And that's really it, right? That's how we understand maternal rage. It is something is happening in your motherhood experience, like you feel unseen and unheard in regards to who you are as a mother, and then the rage develops from that. And there's specific
Okay.
triggers we can look at also. But maternal rage is intimately connected to the experience of motherhood. And then that negative self-talk comes from the guilt and shame that we experience because we are told, again, kind of in popular culture, that mothers aren't allowed to feel this way. Mothers have to be gentle and blissful and happy all of the time. And if you're not those things, then you're doing it wrong. And so that's where this experience of maternal rage comes in, and it's just intimately tied to the experience of motherhood.
So it's really different than like, I'm driving down the highway and I lost it with the guy driving next to me, cut me off and I'm yelling and screaming, right? Or I'm like, or something at work related that irritates me. This is intertwined with the motherhood experience, and that's why we're identifying it as its own kind of unique feature of, dare I say, disorder or disorientation to this new motherhood experience.
That's right. Yes. And I'm from
Okay.
New Jersey, so I get road rage. That's different.
Yeah. Right. We're not calling it the same thing. Of course not. Where does this idea, so irritability by definition is a very important feature for men and women when it comes to anxiety and depression, right? I think it's actually one of the probably the more under-identified components of these diagnoses to me. I think we think about depression as sad and weepy and hopeless and helpless, but we forget the irritability piece that can show up. And especially with anxiety, I think it's probably one of the loudest features is so irritable because they're trying so hard to manage the emotion, the thought process, the feelings they're experiencing. Are we differentiating irritability from maternal rage because there's this like explosive component to it? Is that how you're seeing it?
So irritability, I think it can be both. Irritability is a feature of maternal rage. So, right, it is irritability is this idea that, you're either, so overstimulated or so overwhelmed, or that also can be a feature of it, that it then leads to this explosion, right? So irritability absolutely comes with it. And it's what we typically see in a lot of the definitions of maternal rage is irritability, agitation, things like that.
But it's like the explosiveness that makes it unique in terms of with this diagnosis or this definition. I guess I'm wondering also about like tell me why you feel like there's a value of having a specific term, right? Like, so some, when there's a specific term, sometimes it gives it a lot of power. And therefore, we hopefully maybe even prompt research or treatment or perspective. But I'm wondering how maternal rate is this is just me thinking about it. Like, how
Mhm.
does the definition, having this extra layer of maternal rage, um, how is it beneficial to this population?
That is such a great question. And it's a question that I've asked myself because sometimes labels are not helpful.
Right,
It
right.
can be harmful, right? And what I find when I talk to clients in the therapy room about maternal rage, and I tell them that there is a name for this thing that they're experiencing, that they are not alone in this thing that they're experiencing, that there are features that are common in this experience, right? And then that leads to some interventions and things that we can do to help them with this. The relief is unreal, right? They feel like, okay, I have a name for this thing now. I know it's not just me. That is part of the fear around the experience of maternal rage from like the client perspective, from the person who's experiencing it is I think this is just me, right? Like looking around thinking like I'm the only mom doing this, feeling this way. So that really, I must be doing something wrong, right?
Mm,
And so in this case, I find that having a name for it and being able to speak about it as this thing that you did not create, but that you are experiencing is so powerful. And that really leads us to a path where we can then do some work with it, right? Because it's like, it's not something inherently wrong with you. It's this thing that you are experiencing for a reason. And we can talk about those reasons, but it's like, this didn't come out of nowhere. Like, this-
right, right, right.
yeah.
So before I want to get into some of the reasons or the features of it, like what prompts it, are you experiencing this in isolation, or are you usually seeing this with adjunct or, kind of, yeah, adjunct depression, anxiety, OCD, fill in the blank? Like, are you seeing it? Have you ever seen it where it's just this, or are we usually seeing this as a component, a feature of a unique feature of perinatal depression or postpartum depression and anxiety?
Yeah, I think this is a both and situation. So, me personally, in my practice, I absolutely see maternal rage kind of co-occurring with postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, generalized anxiety. And I also see it occurring by itself. And so, in that case, it would be more along the lines like with an adjustment disorder.
Mm,
Which is
hmm.
technically a diagnosis, right? But can be a little bit more general.
Right.
So yes, and this again, especially during the pandemic where it was like we all had an adjustment disorder essentially as we were
Sure.
trying to adjust to everything that was happening in the world and trying to survive. And then we saw this rage buildup that again was specifically connected to motherhood. So I see both. I see it co-occurring and I also see it just on its own, right? Kind of doing its own thing.
Okay. I want to hear more about I really do feel like so much of this also is the sociological expectations of women and womanhood in general, not even just mothers, but women in general, that historic like demure and mindful, as they say, right? And what was the third line? It's demure and mindful and something. I forget. Whatever.
Yeah,
It's
but
some
talking about.
it's from TikTok. It's some dumb TikTok thing. But so demure and so mindful. And I think that that is what very often is sold as what women are supposed to always be presenting as, meaning anger does not belong here. And the
Mhm.
idea, even just the, I think we talk about this a lot in the in psychology, this idea of the value of anger, the necessity of anger, how we use anger, and how it's used well or not used well. And I think that when I think about that, like the expectation is that it is inappropriate to be angry as a woman. And I have to say, especially because my audience is a lot of religious women, I think especially in a religious upbringing, like that doesn't belong here. That's not appropriate. It's not a character trait that is appropriate for a religious or faith-filled person. And so there's a lot of like pushing away those feelings because it doesn't align with the values in which we were raised. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm only acknowledging that there's some conflict here. And so I can imagine that especially for a religious woman who is raised with this strong value system, then experiencing maternal rage is in such dissonance to who they are as a person that it can be even more, what's wrong with me? I'm a terrible person. How could I be in this space? But can we just talk for a minute about like how you experience that in terms of just women in general being told that like it's like not appropriate for them to be angry or fly off the handle or show their fury, right? Like in some ways, I think men it's a little bit more expected and allowed, and for women, it's just not. What are your thoughts?
I would take it a step further and say for many men, it's actually encouraged, right? So
Mm.
we look at how anger is allowed and encouraged to be expressed and who is allowed to do that expressing, right? When we look at anger in men, a lot of the time we frame it as assertiveness. Like, oh, look at that guy sticking up for his family and what he believes in, or whatever the case might be, however we rationalize it, right? And then for women, we get the opposite. Oh, look at that hysterical woman. Look at that crazy woman. That woman can't control her emotions, right? It is, like you said, it is framed as inappropriate and it is not encouraged by any means. It is discouraged. It is considered, this is actually a really big difference. In men, anger is considered rational. Oh, he feels rage and anger because. Like there is a reason, and that anger and that rage is justified. In women, it is framed as irrational, right? Oh, there can't be a good reason that she is feeling that way. She's just crazy, right? She's just being dramatic. She's just being hysterical. Again, all these terrible things that we hear about women in regards to so many of our emotions, but specifically in regards to anger and rage, it is essentially not allowed. We don't have the privilege, right? Men essentially have the privilege and are then encouraged to express their anger and their rage because it is seen as justified, where for women it is seen as not justified.
You know what's so interesting? It just caught my ear on this is that there's no, the idea of calling somebody a Karen, right? There's no male equivalent of a Karen. I never gave that much consideration. And yet I think that plays right into that rhetoric of like, if a woman says, excuse me, this is not acceptable, or I expect more, I expect different, or I expect to be treated differently. Yes, there are people that I think can fall into the category of the extreme that are that are just very entitled, but not speaking to the extreme. The expectation is that we will just be like, oh, if you don't mind, do you mind? And could you please? And if you don't mind, and yet it's different for men. Yeah, that's just an interesting insight that I never gave much consideration to before. So as we move this idea into maternal rage of how this presents in women, so when you're talking about women experiencing this, especially postpartum, tell me a little bit more about that negative self-talk, and also what are the roots when you see it as, let's say, let's call it, let's focus in on when it's a standalone, right? For that population where actually they don't qualify diagnostically to depression or anxiety, and it's just this behavioral or mood related experience. What's going through? What's the experience?
Right. Well, so guilt and shame come from the idea that we think we have done something wrong, right? And that messaging can come from things that we've internalized. That messaging can come from, external places. There's lots of places that guilt and shame can come from. And then from that guilt and shame, comes this negative self-talk, right? So if I feel like, okay, I'm having this experience of anger, I'm having this experience of rage connected specifically to my motherhood experience, where I have been told essentially that I'm not supposed to feel this, that there's something wrong, that I am feeling this way, right? Then I feel badly if I've done something wrong, right? And so, and then out of that feeling badly and out of that feeling like I've done something wrong, there is something wrong with me as a mother, then the negative self-talk starts to come up, right? I'm a bad mom. I shouldn't be feeling this way. There's something wrong with me. Why can't I just get over this, right? Why can't I just deal with this like the other moms do, right? Again, it's this cycle that kind of perpetuates itself.
And are the trigger points for that, let's like kind of like inflammatory space, right? Where it goes from I'm fine, everything's fine to I am so not fine. Is it always related to like how they're being treated at home or how they're perceived being treated? Like what are the things that create that escalation toward rage?
Yeah, so here I'm gonna go to the research because I think they describe it so well, and I feel like I've learned so much from the academic research in this area. So there's really two things the researchers looked at maternal rage, and these were the patterns that they found, that there were two broad categories of triggers, and those two categories were compromised needs and violated expectations. And that's the exact language that they use in the literature. And I love that they use that language. I think it's such powerful language. And so with compromised needs, it's exactly what it sounds like. Sleep deprivation, being hungry, honestly, not even having a chance to feed yourself when you have young kids. So it could be those types of physical things, but compromised needs could also be something along the lines of, I thought I was going to be in this place in my career right now, and now I feel like I'm putting the needs of my family first, and that feels like a compromised need. I feel like I'm not achieving what I want to be achieving in, in my career, or even in my personal life, right? I don't feel connected to people the way I want to feel connected to them. That's a compromised need, right? So all of those things can fall. That is a really broad category. A lot of things can fall under compromised needs. And then violated expectations similarly can be, this is what's interesting about violated expectations. They can be internal or external. So we can violate our own expectations, or somebody outside of us can violate our expectations. So for example, if somebody is going into the parenthood experience for the first time and they are thinking, my partner and I, or my family and I, we are going to split the household labor equitably, right? And then the baby comes and that doesn't happen. One partner, the mother, usually it's skewed and she's doing most of the labor, the mental load of motherhood, all of that, right? And she is feeling like this is not what I signed up for. This wasn't the expectation that I had going into this, right? That's a violated expectation. Another violated expectation could be something along the lines of, I thought my workplace was going to support me, and now they're giving me a hard time about the amount of time that I would like to take for maternity leave, right? Another expectation, I thought my toddler was going to love being an older sibling, but they don't. They're struggling, right? I could go on and on. So, and then those are external. And then the way we can violate our own expectations is, I didn't think I
I
was
th
going to feel this way,
right. I
right?
thought I would be a calm mother.
Yes. I didn't think it was
Hmm.
going to be like this. And that's us violating our own expectations. So those are the two broad categories that we see in terms of triggers that lead to the explosion of maternal rage.
And that also really identifies for me that it doesn't mean there's a very specific moment of trigger, meaning you could wake up rageful, right?
Mhm.
And that's where I guess some of that like kind of interplay with that and just a general irritability, that if all of what I'm living every day feels like I have compromised needs or unmet or violated expectations, then the reality is that much of my daytime experience could be something that feels like I am going to lose it at any time, which is different than there's an event, they didn't put away the laundry, they didn't fold they didn't put the socks in the hamper, and therefore I lose it, which I think many people, when you hear maternal rage, that at least to me, that's what I could have seen it defined as like an event happened. It made me so angry and out of control, but that's not what you're describing here. right? So it could be an event, but it also could be this just ongoing static experience or, kind of state experience. And rather and that doesn't necessarily get better by tomorrow. So, okay. So knowing that, what do we do with this? Either, I think I would love to hear
Good
you,
question.
right? That's the big question because I'm like, okay, I can't always convince them to put the socks in the hamper, but what are some of the ways I want you to put your therapist hat on for working with the population that we're talking about, but I also really would like you to speak to the mothers. So maybe let's start with that. Let's start with speaking to the moms. What are some of I mean, first of all, I agree with you now that I hear this idea of like knowing where it's coming from. Wow, that really gives a sense of structure to, yeah, these are things that this is why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. Tell me a little bit more about when you would talk to moms. What's that like?
So I'm actually going to start where you left off because you actually already started to go into one of the interventions that I like to use, which I call widening the lens, right? So there is a reason that when something seems like this singular event, right? Like somebody leaving dirty laundry on the floor, and that seems to then trigger this explosion in the mom, right? It's frequently not about the laundry on the floor, right? And it's frequently not something that happened one time. It's usually connected to something bigger. So that is where I start that conversation with the moms that I work with, right? So we use, and I think that this is something that I go back to all of the time in my therapeutic work, is we try to use curiosity and not judgment, right? Because if we judge that experience, right? And then it's like the laundry on the floor is probably not that big of a deal. Like, why are you getting so upset about it, right? That's already the rhetoric that mom has going on in her head, right? So what we want to do is we want to kind of dial that back and we want to ask, we essentially want to say, there is a reason that that event was so upsetting to you. Talk to me about your internal dialogue when you saw that dirty laundry on the floor, right? Talk to me about what was happening in your body, right? Talk to me about what happened the day before when your other three kids did the same thing. and was creating all of this labor for you and they're old enough to know better, right? And you've asked them to do this before, right? Talk to me about what that is like for you. And then I get answers like, it feels like nobody sees all of the work that I do. It feels like I'm not appreciated, right? It feels like what I do doesn't matter. And that hurts. That hurts when part of your life's work, because I mean, that is, I know as a mom, that is a huge part of my life's work, right? Is the work that I do as a mother. And to feel unappreciated and unseen and taken for granted, that hurts. And then that hurt is then what leads to the rage, right? Because it's like, I want to be seen too, right? I want to be appreciated. Like this is a big deal and nobody thinks it's a big deal, right? And that's hurtful. And so I think it's important to open all of that up for our clients and allow them to go there and allow them to talk about their needs, right? Because that's another thing that happens frequently for mothers is our needs get pushed into the background, right? And so what we want to do is, and I think this is something that we run up a lot against in therapy, right? Where we talk about, oh, well, then you just need to bring your needs to the foreground. And it's like, it's not that easy when you're a mother, right? And also, we need to give mothers agency. They need to decide when their needs come to the foreground, right? Because if my kids are sick, guess whose needs are not in the foreground? Mine. And that's okay because I'm making that decision because that's what they need in that moment, right? Part of what happens in maternal rage is our agency gets taken away. It feels like we have no power, right? So those feelings of powerlessness lead to feelings of injustice that then lead to the explosion. I think that was a very roundabout answer to
No,
your.
it's a great trip, all the way there. Let me ask you a question. One of the things that I find I really struggle with these kind of interventions, is the idea of like, how do I then get my forget put I want to put aside the word needs and go focus in on that word of being seen, of being acknowledged, of being appreciated, right? Because that really depends on other people, right? I can't self-appreciate, right? The idea is, do you see me? Do you, my partner, assuming there's a spouse, like, do you see me? Do you understand how hard this is? Or do you not realize that when you put your socks on the floor, it's more labor and responsibility for me, and I don't feel appreciated. And the challenge I think we all see is that sometimes partners are not able to, capable of, or willing, fill in the blank, to offer what is needed, right, to meet the feelings and emotional experience of their spouse.
Yeah, that is the challenge. So I only work with individuals, right? I don't do couples work. I refer out for that. I'm happy to refer to the to the experts for that. So that's a real challenge that I'm constantly coming up against with my clients. So what I do is I encourage them to have those conversations with their partners, with their families. I encourage them to go to the place of the feeling, right? Because if we're just talking about the socks on the floor or the shoes not being put on or things not being put away, right? Then we're just talking about the thing at the surface. We have to go beneath that. Talk about how hurt you are, right? Talk about what that feels like to feel like you are not seen or heard or cared for, right? And the hope is then the people that care for you will respond to that. And what I tell clients is exactly what you just said. You can't make people do that, right? But you can create the space for that, right? So you tell them how you feel, and then you give them some space to take initiative, because that's really what we are asking for. The other thing that I tell clients is, part of what can sometimes be hard about motherhood is even as hard as we're trying, we sometimes don't feel competent in that place in our life, right? And that is both a compromised need and a violated expectation. I thought I was going to be good at this. I care so much about my children. Why is this so hard, right? And so if you are struggling with feeling competent in your motherhood role, it is okay to look elsewhere so that you can feel competent. I am personally a better mother because of the work that I do in the therapy room, because of the professional roles that I have, because of the relationships I have outside of my family with my dear friends, right? Those are places where I can go to feel to feel confident, to feel like I get good feedback. I'm doing a good job here. It's sometimes really hard to get good feedback as a mother, right?
Agreed.
So it is really important. And again, this is where we have to give our clients agency, asking them, what is it that they're interested in? Where in their lives do they feel competent? Is it a creative endeavor? Great, then let's figure out a way to do that. Part of what we see in the literature around maternal rage is we see this term, it's called meaningful non-parenting activities. Now, let's first start out with saying that many times being able to engage in meaningful non-parenting activities is absolutely a privilege. You have to be able to make time for it. You need to have the space for it, literally and figuratively. But meaningful non-parenting activities is exactly what it sounds like, right? It's this idea that you get to have space outside of your life as a mother, right? Whether that to be to do something that's fun, whether that to be to do something that is professionally fulfilling, but those meaningful non-parenting activities, they turn down the temperature for us
Mm,
like wholesale, right? And it then we are in when we get to engage in those meaningful non-parenting activities, we are then kind of in a different space when we're at home because we have those outlets, right? And so I frequently describe it to my clients as sometimes you just need the ability to hear yourself think.
right.
And so frequently as mothers, that is like stripped away from us, right? And so if you can even find just moments where you can hear yourself think again, that can be really powerful in terms of, again, just turning the temperature down in general so that you're showing up differently.
I think also that idea of being seen, I think about what is it like to be in a nice relationship with a friend or going out for coffee if you have that opportunity, like even just taking a walk around the block to be seen can feel and look different for each person. But ultimately, it's like outside of the parenting realm or role, there is opportunity that I can feel seen or I can feel like my needs are being met that are actually independent of my spouse offering them to me,
That's
which I
exactly
think
right.
is also opportunity where I can't create this up. I can't meet my own needs. I can't necessarily do things for myself, to myself. This is going to sound weird, but like this idea of like, I can experience that on some level elsewhere. And that having, which also just validates that incredible responsibility and need to have relationship outside of parenting or outside of the spousal relationship exclusively, like making sure that we nurture and nourish, if we can, in some capacity, some of those friendships and relationships too.
Yeah.
Could we come back to when we see rage as a feature of or a component of depression and anxiety? How does it look or sound different?
It doesn't. It doesn't. It is, it's just co-occurring, right? So you'll have the depressive features, however that looks for the individual, and then you'll have this rage with the agitation, the irritability, the explosion, the aftermath. So it doesn't.
Hmm. It's interesting. I'm wondering if there's some. I'm wondering if the trigger points are if the fuse is shorter, or if the like if you have anxiety already and you're already on edge with the irritability, that the opportunity for explosive reactivity is higher.
Yes. So I think that's where the difference is, not in terms of what we're seeing in the expression of the rage, but especially if we take anxiety, for instance, right? A frequent trigger for anxiety is overstimulation, right? And feeling overwhelmed, right? Already feeling like if somebody's really struggling with anxiety, typically their system is already on edge, right? Their nervous system, their cognitive system, they're always waiting for the other shoe to drop, is usually how it's described to me with clients, right? So if your fuse is already that short because of the anxiety, and then something happens like this, like an event, right, that can then trigger the rage. Yes, I would say that that absolutely happens when the fuse is already shorter because of something like anxiety. Then yes, we are
Yeah.
more prone to
Right.
episodes of mom rage. Yeah.
And I would think also just like I feel like when we're working with people who have anxiety and depression, there are especially anxiety, I think they're incredibly uncomfortable. Like they're just physically, emotionally uncomfortable. And then you compound that with violated expectations and compromised needs, like you're looking at a tinderbox. You really are. And so it also reminds me that I think is just as like a message to the world, like if you're seeing this kind of explosiveness, don't just look at it as, oh my gosh, she's like losing it. And look at it as more from a what else is going on in this person's life and how can we assist to kind of take down some of that temperature that is so hot right now. Um, anything I'm we didn't discuss paternal rage or paternal irritability, and I don't want to put this only on the moms, right? Because I think as you started off our conversation, you talked about the word like you use this term, that there's so much it's transformative, that parenthood and motherhood is transformative. I've actually kind of leaning into the word that maternal that I think that motherhood or perinatal mood disorders are in many ways a diagnosis of transition, right? And so when we think about where there is vulnerability for women who experience perinatal mood disorders, we always talk about hormonal vulnerability, like when there was this significant shift in hormones and that creates this vulnerability that can result in, and that's where like the depression anxiety shows up. I really see this as well if we notice that women have the same level of like fluctuation when they go through menopause or perimenopause, which we're going to be talking about, I hope soon, or when we're going through weaning of breastfeeding, or hormonal changes that happen with contraception, right, with birth control. So if we know that these are that areas of transition are spaces of vulnerability, I am wondering, we have to acknowledge that men experience this as well. And what's your experience with that?
So they do. The problem is how we frame it, right? So I get the same question around mom guilt. Like, why is there no such term as dad guilt, right? Why don't we talk about paternal rage the way we talk about maternal rage? And it's because of how it's framed. The reason that moms experience mom guilt, or the way we define mom guilt and dads don't experience it that way, is because of the expectations that we have on mothers, right? Honestly, it's the same thing with maternal rage, right? We're talking about maternal rage because of the expectations, or a big part of it is because of the expectations that we have for moms that we don't have for dads. And again, we frame paternal anger as situational, as rational, and then we encourage it. Those kids, that dad needed to discipline those
Ah.
kids. They were out of line instead of that mom was out of line for how she responded. That is the difference that I see. So, and honestly, that's the difference that we see borne out in some of the literature too, is there are different expectations for dads. And so that leads to different outcomes. I'm going to go back to your question where you talked about this idea of like, well, we can't make partners do anything, right? We can't. They need to take some initiative, right? And I think I'm going to come back to that because that's so important, right? We need partners taking initiative, right? So that helps with some of these expectations, right? We need to start shifting these expectations in terms of what we expect for mothers and fathers and families. And then that changes this entire dynamic, right?
Right.
So looking at the environment is critically important. Looking at those family relationships is critically important because that's what's brought us to this place.
Yeah. I do think, though, that this idea of compromised needs or violated expectations has to show up for men as well, of how they
Oh,
imagine their life looking with a
right,
newborn, right? Or how they thought their wife or spouse or would look like, and, or,
right,
not just physically, but just in terms of like her availability, or what, that their relationship would look just as good as it did before, or that their house would look a certain way, right? And like, so even just putting aside the expectations of how they would manage the emotional experience. But I've
right.
got to believe that if we're listening carefully, we
Yeah,
might actually, if we know that men experience perinatal mood disorders possibly as a 1 in 10, right? To then we know it's there too. But I love this idea, and I'm thinking about this as a therapist now, like putting that therapist hat on, of like, that if we're listening for compromised needs and violated expectations, wouldn't that open up that conversation with our clients in such a unique and interesting way? Like,
yeah.
can you tell me these, just pick those two categories of this transition into parenthood, mother or father, and tell me what this means to you? Kind of an interesting, not an intake question, but definitely a discussion question that I love.
Absolutely. I would actually take that a step further. So, the way we currently frame rage and anger for men is that it is productive, right? And what I love about the literature on maternal rage is that they also frame it as productive. So, I
Mm,
think we are getting somewhere with that. Maternal rage is framed as a catalyst for change. And I think what could be more powerful than that to say, you are experiencing this for a reason, right? And we know that you don't want to be experiencing this, right? And so we're going to give you some tools. We're also going to look at the larger environment. We're going to look at the larger society. We're going to look at all of these factors. And then we're going to say, this can also lead to positive and productive change. We're not just going to leave you here feeling these really difficult and challenging emotions, right? And I think that is where we can actually get families and mothers and fathers on the same page, is this idea that you are experiencing, of course, men are experiencing this, right? Well, again, we just frame it out as differently. We frame it out as, oh, well, that dad is just reacting to this situation. Guess what? The mom is too. Mom
right.
is
Right.
too. So let's actually use that and use that in a productive way. Do we need to change something in her environment then? Does she need some more support? And what does that support look like? Does she need more meaningful non-parenting activities? And what does that look like, right? And then we get the interventions are the same for fathers, right? The difference is how we frame it. So we're already framing it in a positive and productive way for men and fathers, and that's actually what we need to do for mother. So I love that you brought that up and that you framed it that way because that's actually where we need to go with this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I do want to, before I forget, you mentioned a book, but you didn't say its name. Do you remember the
Oh,
name of the book?
yes.
What is that book called?
So the book on maternal rage is called Mom Rage. It's by Minna Dubin, and she is amazing. So she's actually originally from Philadelphia. She's actually
Hmm.
now out in the San Francisco area. Her kids are actually around the same age as my kids. So my kids are 12 and 8. Her kids are around the same age-ish. And she started writing articles about mom rage, and one of them went viral in the New York Times during the pandemic. And the article was titled "The Rage That Mothers Don't Speak About." And that was the first time I had seen maternal rage written about in that way. And I thought
Wonderful.
that was so powerful. So, and clearly a lot of other people did too, because the article, went absolutely viral and then led to this book that she wrote. And she is, in general, just a wonderful writer, but I love the combination of memoir, her own personal experience, and then she brings in all of this research. Another great book just on feminized anger and the idea of female anger is called Rage Becomes Her by Shariah Shamali. And that book was actually a precursor to Mom Rage. So that book came out in like 2018, 2019, kind of at the height of Me Too, and really changed our conversation about female rage and placed it in specifically in this area of, wait a second, women are reacting this way for a reason, and we can use this as a catalyst for change. This is a righteous rage, right? And then that, I feel like real, or I saw it anyway, really opening the door to how we talk differently about maternal rage. So
Okay,
those are the
great.
two books I highly recommend
Great.
this
So
topic.
let's wrap up with tell me some of the misconceptions that you wish people would understand better.
Yeah, so the first one that comes to mind for me when we're talking about mom rage is that it came out of nowhere. Like it just showed up one day. This mom just exploded one day. And where did that come from, right? And where what we actually know and what you and I have talked about is this idea that no, it comes from somewhere and we need to explore where it comes from, that it really is this righteous rage that is connected to something deeper, right? And then we need to look both at the individual level and then pull it all the way out to the societal and cultural level. So that is the biggest misconception that I see when it comes to mom rage.
That's great. Do you have a second one for me?
A second one I would say is that it's an individual issue, right? Like,
Mm.
let's just use some anger management techniques with this mom, right? And then she's going to be fine. And it's like, no. So that can be part of it, right? We absolutely, working with clients individually, want to help our clients and give them interventions, right? We can talk about breathing techniques, we can talk about other, cognitive strategies, somatic strategies, all of that. Those are all helpful. But then what we need to do in conjunction with that is we need to then look at the familial factors, the societal factors, the cultural factors. And even if we can't affect change immediately in those areas, believe me, I wish that we could. But even if we can't, just talking about them and letting that mom know, I know that this isn't just you, right? And I know that what you are experiencing is connected to the world that you live in, essentially, and the world that you engage with. And let's talk about that, right? And let's at some point start to talk about if there are places where you can affect change. But just starting that conversation and letting an individual mother know that, like, hey, this isn't just you. There's a reason that you're experiencing this. That's really, really powerful. I think that's the most powerful intervention, in fact.
I think that's fabulous. And I will add like one more little one, just because I think that one of knowing that very often this is sold as like a character trait failure, like a
Mm,
failure in your character, that this is not about a failure of character. And this is, and we must look at it more, I think, diagnostically and look at it systemically and diagnostically. And when we do that, then we also remove some of the shamefulness or the feeling of there's something wrong with me and I need to improve my character and improve my midot and my midos and I can become better at who I am and then I won't be so angry. And if we look at it more broadly, we actually can affect change, but with and also minimizing some of that shame and guilt that can show up there when we think it's a character failure. So I'll leave that as number three.
yeah,
Nicole,
I
this
love
was a
it.
wonder. This was a great conversation, jam-packed with info. Anything else that I didn't touch on that you want to make sure that I cover, or did we get to everything as far as you can tell?
Oh no, yeah, we got to everything, and I'm so thankful for you opening up this conversation, and I'm excited to keep doing so. I think it's an important conversation to have, and I hope your listeners get a lot out of it.
I know they will. Thank you so much for spending some time with me.
Thank you.